Welcome to the 2023 Fall Lecture Series at Grey Roots Museum and Archives. I'm your host, Karen Noble. We wish to begin by respectfully acknowledging that our community gathering place is situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires known as the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi Nations, and further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, known collectively as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of these lands and waters. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and friendship with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Today is the third talk of the Fall 2023 series and the first online pre-recorded talk available from Grey Roots YouTube channel. These virtual talks will remain available for repeat viewing. Next Tuesday, November 28th, is the final talk of the series and the second online talk, The Meaford Tank Range Story, with Stephanie McMullen, premieres from greyroots.com at 1 p.m. And now for the presentation of the day, lest we forget, Grey County's Black Military History. Talk presenter, Bonita Johnson-deMatteis, is a researcher, author, and artist. Her design for the Black History Cairn at Owen Sound's Harrison Park celebrates the long-standing tradition of the Owen Sound Emancipation Picnic and Black history of the area. Bonita also compiled a book about Grey County Black soldiers to complement Grey Roots' From Slavery to Freedom exhibit. This book won the Ontario Museum Association Award of Merit for 2003, and her work to expand this research is ongoing. And now, welcome, Bonita.
Hi. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks for allowing me to come here and speak about this. I can't believe it's been 20 years since we compiled this book. Stephanie McMullen and I just digging around, and it's more of this book is more of a compilation of a collection of love and stories. There's very little authorship of mine in it. But anyway, here's a look at the commemorative book. Lovely. It feels like leather, and it has a military feel to it. And poppy, and then the embossed "Lest We Forget." So this is the book that lives up here at the museum. So about 20 years ago, I'm sitting in my back room at home on an old iMac Tangerine computer, and I have a scanner and I have a printer. And these are actually the pages from the printer. They're old and they're crunchy, but they have these figures, these faces on the pages. I'm just turning this randomly right now, and then it'll make more sense in a few minutes. So I would be up late churning out these pages, trying to write military data, military stats, their numbers, date of enlistments, and I knew nothing of this language, and I don't know that much more, except that I know it's vital. It's information, vital information. So I would be, after working till about 1 o'clock in the morning, I'd go upstairs, close my eyes, and I'd see these haunting visions of these men that had seen such horror. Not just horror of war, but the invisibleness of their color when they got home. So much so that if I had been born into another family, I wouldn't have known of my father's and his brothers' enlistments and their service in, the Second World War, and my Uncle David Johnson, who was in the Korean campaign. And for years, we understood that the Korean vets weren't recognized as veterans. And then that was a big day when that was overturned and finally recognized. So anyway, I might go off on a tangent. I'm not very good at lecturing. I don't like being lectured, but I'm here to tell you some stories. So I would come across these beautiful pictures of my uncles and my father. This is one of them. This is my uncle David, who was in the Korean service, and this is a photo of him and his mother, his father, and him. That was the day before he shipped out. And he told me, he said, I shipped out day before my 18th birthday. I turned 18 as I crossed the international date line. And I cried like a baby. He said, I was so far away from home. I was going to jump overboard. He was so scared. These were boys, little boys, right? And I shouldn't say little boys, but what would we expect of an 18 and 19-year-old these days? This is my father, Melfort Johnson, and then some other photos when he was in Italy with a buddy. So we had these sacred pictures hanging around the house. This is another one of my father, of course. And I would think, well, jeepers, if I have these beautiful photos, other people in my family must, my other cousins. So when we'd go down to the Emancipation picnic in August, I started asking people, not just my family, but local families as well. Wilbur Johnson. These are all Owen Sound, Grey County soldiers. So people started saying, well, yeah, my uncle or my aunt, my cousin, they were in the service, right? And so I would be entrusted with these photos, and I'd take them home to my computer and scan them. Then I'd have to, on pain of death, get these photos back to them, because it was before I understood, or I don't even know if the technology was there to scan a photo and just send it email. I don't know. Could have been. I wasn't hooked up. I was on dial-up. So I get these beautiful photos coming to me in the mail, along with little handwritten stories from my cousins or whoever donated the pictures. So slowly but surely, we started compiling these from the First World War, Second World War, and the Korean effort. And then it came to my attention about the No. 2 Battalion. I had never heard of it. So there's one page in here that has the crest. And that's all I knew about the No. 2 Battalion. And happily, not this summer past, but the summer before, the Emancipation Festival had, and Grey Roots had Kathy Grant here to speak in depth about the No. 2. And since then, the commemorative services out in Nova Scotia. So a lot has happened in 20 years. So just a quick little story about my dad. He enlisted he was living in Niagara Falls at the time. And I'll show you how the connection is from my dad to Owen Sound. But his uncle, Moses Earls, was visiting him and his sister, which was my dad's mother. So we had these big, long families, big extended families. And somebody called him and said, Mosey, you got a brown envelope in the mail. You better go and enlist. So he thought, oh man. So him and my dad went in and enlisted. And he came back home, Uncle Moses Earls, came back home to Owen Sound to find out that that brown envelope in the mail was an income tax return or something. So he went and enlisted, because the story was, if you enlisted before you got conscripted, you could go wherever you wanted, Navy, Army, whatever. So anyway, he came home and, but anyway, he was happy, he served. Okay, so let's give you a little background of my family and my dad and the connection with Owen Sound. So my dad is Douglas Melfort Johnson, and he was born March 29th, 1921, in Dresden, Ontario, another large Black community. He was the fourth child of Reverend Clifford and Susie Johnson. Susie Earls was her maiden name, and she was born here in Owen Sound. She is the oldest daughter of Solomon and Sarah Earls. My grandfather and my grandmother were both ministers of the VME Church. And they traveled all through Ontario and were stationed in different places and had the children born in different places. Uncle David was born in Guelph. Others were born in Dresden. So wherever the church sent them, kind of like the military, wherever they sent you, you served. So while they were in Niagara Falls, this is when my father went and enlisted. So they had 4 sons that enlisted. Clarence Johnson, who served in the Army in World War II, and he was honorably discharged because during training he would dislocate his shoulder. And the jumps and the rolls and all of the groundwork that the soldiers had to learn was, wrecking his body. He couldn't serve. So anyway, he went into the ministry, and he did serve. He didn't want to serve, but he served because his country called him. And so after being discharged, he went into the ministry himself. So then we have, there's Clarence Johnson, Douglas Johnson, my dad, Beverly Johnson, who went and served in the Navy in Nova Scotia. And of course, David Johnson, the youngest serving son, went to Korea. My grandfather, Reverend Clifford Johnson, was the grandson of James W. Johnson, a former slave, who came to Canada as a member of a Drew settlement, Canadian township. And that was established by Josiah Henson. So there's this direct link back. So Susan Earls, she would later become a Wilson, was the eldest daughter of Solomon Earls and Sarah Woods Earls. Solomon was the 4th youngest of 6 children of a former slave, Elias Earls, born in Kentucky in 1933, who settled in Holland Township after marrying, and they moved to Onsound. And this is where they raised their family. Solomon Earls, sadly, was killed in a detonation accident in Onsound, the Oliver Quarries, on October 29th, 1924. So Douglas Melfort, excuse me, I'm just kind of reading off here, so it is a lecture, right? So Douglas Melfort Johnson enlisted in Hamilton when he was 21 years old, January 6, 1942. With the number 2 District Depot, he was assigned to the Ontario Tank Regiment, the Sea Wing. After completing basic training in the Canadian Tank Corps at Cape Borden, he was shipped overseas to England in July of 42. While in England, he completed Q Command boxing course. And then he was taken on the strength of his ability. He was taken on the strength TOS. That's an acronym they use, to the number 1 Canadian Base Replacement Depot in June, and then shipped out to Africa, North Africa, where he trained. He trained these guys in grappling. He trained the soldiers in grappling, just basic hand combat skills. And they were there for quite a long time, and they were getting kind of antsy until they got the call. They had to go. They were going to be shipped to Italy, where the Tank Corps roared around and shot holes through all of the villages that they had to get up into the mountains, because the Germans had already been there for quite a long time, and they had foothold in all the villages because they were up in the mountains. So the Allies had to get up there somehow, and they used the tanks and the skills of those men. It was there that he was confirmed as a sergeant in 1943, and he held this rank until 1945. And while he was serving in Italy, my dad was wounded. And he told us the story of waking up and seeing a plume of smoke out of the window, and it was Mount Vesuvius. It had just erupted a week or so before, and it was still hot, and it was smoke all over the place. So he brought that story home. And this was just outside of Naples, where he convalesced, and he celebrated his 23rd birthday there while he was recuperating. And it was then he went from the tank regiment, and he was enlisted to the Irish Regiment of Canada. And then they went on to France. And then they went on to Holland and Belgium. And then back into England. So during that time, 5 years or so, 5 years was his tour. It's, unimaginable what he saw, what he felt. He had told stories of sitting in the trenches with buddies, waiting for something to happen. They were always waiting, but they knew something was going to happen. And they smoked like crazy, and people would send them packages of gifts, for socks, and the odd time they get a loaf of bread. And in the loaf of bread, even though it was all stale and green and moldy, was a bottle. And they would share the bottle. They'd pass the bottle around in their little huddle. And Dad told the story once of he turned around to get a cigarette lit from another buddy and turned back. And there had been an explosion. And he said, it wasn't that a person was exploded, they would implode. And their bones would shatter. And they would just fall to the floor in a heap. So the suddenness of every day something happening does something to the human brain. It is called trauma. We hear a lot about trauma now. Back then we didn't. There were other stories where he felt he didn't I'm not saying that this is just particular to my father. I think it was particular to the whole generation of those young men. He would be marching in line in formation. And one time he stepped out of line to go tie his shoes. And then when he did the hop, skip, and jump to get back into his formation, the guy that had fallen in to take his place in the formation was killed. Was shot, boom, just like that. So we always thought that should have been me. That wasn't the only incident. There was another incident when in the tank, he'd be, the sergeant. Come on, Sarge, let me have a look. Let me have a tour. Let me have a look. So he said, okay. And he let this younger soldier get up, pop the lid, and look where they were traveling, and he got killed, just like that, just in a matter of a few seconds. Just, what are the chances? So he felt he didn't deserve to be alive. So he brings this belief home with him. And he had no problem getting girls. And there were some girls waiting for him. But then he met my mom, a white lady, and had all of us wonderful children. And the trauma that lived with him, as with a lot of post-traumatic stress disordered soldiers, they couldn't keep it together. His alcoholism, took over his life. As much as we know, he loved us. He couldn't parent us. And there was constant fights between him and my mother. So we ended up being wards of the Children's Aid Society. And my father's mother took us children in. and she couldn't keep us all, so some of us went to one of her sisters, and some other uncles and brothers stepped up. And so we all knew who we were and what our family was, and who we belonged to. So my father died when I was 19 years old. He was only 57. And I was really angry because I'm thinking, I'm the youngest, I'm 19. I hardly got to know him the way the older kids got to know him. So I was quite resentful of him. I didn't care who was a soldier. I thought that was a big excuse, blame everything on the war. So I spent most of my adult life being very angry with him until I started going to school and university, taking psychology courses and understanding what post-traumatic stress disorder is. So I now do counseling. I'm a registered psychotherapist. And the stories I hear are tantamount to a soldier's story: sexual abuse, domestic abuse, because the parallels are this. You go to war, you sign up, you are respected, you are honored, people applaud you as you march through towns, you're heroes. But sitting in that uniform and in the mud and in the trenches and the noise of the theater of war, you never know when it's going to end. It's random. Yes, you have your marching orders. You don't know where you're going. You don't know if you're coming back alive. Same with domestic sexual abuse. Victims of that, they don't know when it's going to end. They don't know if they're going to come out alive. They don't know if their children are going to be okay. So there are different parallels of uncertainty, the randomness. There's a control test, that very famous control test that they did with rats. 12 in one cage, 12 in another. The cage was metal. They electrified one cage. They electrified the other. Cage number one, the zots of electricity happened regularly, every 15 seconds or so, or 30 seconds. And the rats became accustomed to that, like in their bodies. They kind of, oh, here comes, okay, I got shocked. Oh, here comes the next one. Here comes the next one. In the other cage, they were electrified randomly every 5 seconds, and then maybe not for another minute or so, then every 15 seconds. It was the randomness that their bodies couldn't absorb, and they died. So that famous control test just shows that the irregularity of shock is very lethal in a mammal's existence. So when my dad died, we all went to, I think it's Mount Pleasant in London, the military part of the graveyard, and we see, we're looking for our father's headstone that was made, and it was supposed to, we were looking for Sergeant Melfort Johnson. We couldn't find a Sergeant Johnson anywhere, but we did find a Private Johnson, and that was him. The story was, at the end of the war, he went AWOL. Now, going AWOL wasn't a big deal. Apparently, a lot of soldiers did it. They, they just didn't get paid for those days. They'd go for a weekend or something. So, and sometimes they had to, go in the brink, do time. But this time my dad went AWOL, and it was right at the end of the war. It was won. And he was finally caught and punished for it. And he was told, you're a sergeant. You did this thing. I don't know if we can show that picture of him in England. He's in, I think it's Trafalgar Square. He has his kilt on, he has his, git on, and with his dog. And that's when he was AWOL. And he was away for, I don't know, maybe a little bit over a week. So they said, as a sergeant, you will have to be punished for this. You're going to do some time. But as a private, you're going to go home a lot sooner. So he surrendered his stripes. Once he got home, he was hailed as a hero. He could go into any bar in any place in Ontario and be given a drink. So life was hard and easy for him. He really wanted to be one of the first Black commissioned soldiers, but that didn't happen for him. Not just soldiers, sorry, I meant to say sergeant, and clearly that didn't happen for him. So he would come home and try to raise his family, and it was a struggle. So that's just one story out of this book. So everybody else has stories. They're not for me to tell. They're not of, they're not my dad. But I'm sure all of these stories have more stories behind them. So if you have friends, ask them their story while they're still around of any war. So anyway, I think that's about my flow of what I wanted to say. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Bonita. I really appreciate you doing this presentation, and it is great to have the enormity of the sacrifice highlighted for this series.
Absolutely.
Just had a few little questions that I thought might pick your brain, get your expertise, having done so many years of research ongoing here and there and talking with people. Other than talking, you just mentioned talking with people and their memories. Do you have any tips for people doing research? So maybe of their family member.
Just be persistent. I'm reminded that Alec Haley, who, when he wrote Roots, he kept saying to people, young kids, at the time I might have been 14 or something when this book came out. He said, just keep asking them. He said, you're going to meet resistance because they're going to, first of all, think their story is not important. They're going to think, what do you want to know for? And then they're going to have to take time to remember. But if you're persistent, they're going to be convinced that you really want to know. And you have to approach them with that love, and respect for this story, and give them the time to surface it, because to bring it to the front of their mind, because it will be buried, like they're getting about life, and all of the stuff that's going on now. And they probably think, oh, well, that was then, and I've dealt with it. It's packed away nicely. Just case in point, it's not a military story, but I had a cousin, Doris Green, one of the green girls from Owen Sound, and she went to the OSCDI, the OSC, and she was quite athletic, and she, anyway, she was like, wow, if you could run like Doris, you're. So at the emancipation picnics about 3 or 4 years ago, before Black Eyed Peas and Races, before I put that one together, I kept asking her, I said, now come on, Doris, tell me about your races, when you ran, because we'd have races down at the family picnic too, and it was a big deal, right? And first 2 years, she just says, nah, I don't want to talk about that. And I don't remember that. Because it may have a person sound like they're bragging about themselves, and people don't, they don't want to brag about themselves, right? So the last year, I said, come on, Doris, tell me about a race. Did you ever lose a race? And she turns, she goes, not any race I ran. So that was her moment of bragging, and and so I finally got her to, admit that she was unbeatable. Not any race I ran, she said. So I was like that. So it took a long time for her to believe that I really wanted to know, and I just wasn't making small talk. So I just say be persistent and respectful.
Another question that we had from a fellow staff person. Your thoughts on men serving in both wars? Why they might go back?
Oh,
1 and 2.
yes. Okay, so we have an example of that. Father and son, First and Second World War. Hang on just a sec. It's been a while since I've turned this. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to go through another page, but I believe this is the family here. I think it was father and son, James Hall. Yep, that's them. That's the First World War. Then they went back in Second World War. And I can just only imagine. It's the brotherhood. It's the purposefulness. It's, a lot of people say, at my uncle's funeral, at my Uncle David's funeral, his son got up and spoke and said, my dad loved this country, but this country didn't love my dad back. So I think that's a common thought, reality in a lot of these soldiers' lives. So to get a chance to do it again, to go back and hopefully, prove their worth as Canadian citizens, that this is our country, and not to be just kind of like overlooked, but even with the color piece put aside, I think it's just the love of service. It's the love of history and the country. And I'm going to come back to the brotherhood statement. I've understood by listening to the men talk, my uncles and their cousins, that there's nothing like it. And they laugh, they talk about other people and other guys in the regiment and how they doing double time as punishment, and so there's this bond that I don't think they'd get anywhere else, sadly, and I don't even think they get it in their marriages sometimes. So I'll just leave that there.
This is kind of on the same theme, the camaraderie theme. A question about World War I soldiers who got assigned to the construction battalion that you mentioned in your talk, and those who did not. And maybe it was just life circumstances why some would be in the construction battalion and why some not.
I don't think there was a choice. I think at that time, and please, anybody out there correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was the only choice given to servicemen of color. They wanted to serve. My recollection is the men wanted to serve. They wanted to step up. They were forbidden or put aside, saying, no, this is not your fight. And they're going, well, yes, it is. We live here. This is our country. If something happens to this country and, a fascist regime takes over Canada, where are we? I've heard Indigenous men say the same thing. We got a rough rate now. What's it going to be if we get a non-friendly regime in here? So yes, we have to fight. We don't stand a chance anywhere else. So we're stepping up. So the men that stepped up, First World War, I believe they were put aside And then finally, they created the number 2 battalion. And I'm just going on the little bits of information I gleaned 20 years ago that's in the book, the one page. And then shortly after the war, the number 2 battalion was dismantled. And I don't think it was that, and I think that's why it went into such obscurity, why you couldn't find a lot on the battalion until, a few years ago, people were coming out of the woodwork with photos and letters from their grandparents, great grandparents, and their letters from home, what they had to endure or what they built or what, so all of a sudden the lid was taken off of that. That regiment, that service, it was dismantled by the Canadian government. No more recognition. So I hope that is it.
Just have a question about your art. Do you find that you often create art as a component of your research, or does it depend?
Oh, wow. As far as my painting's concerned, I think that comes out of a place of, just happiness or just wanting to throw something colorful together. As far when I get into like researching books and people's stories, I'm more apt to go with photographs, old photographs. And I know my cousin Tony Miller, he loves to paint from the archival old black and white photos. An amazing job. So I kind of tippy-toe away from that because he's the king on that one, So I also find if I'm writing, I find it hard to paint. Like I don't know, it takes up too much of my brain. And when I'm painting, I can't be bothered getting into the minutia of writing. So I think I haven't married them yet. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. Yeah, I was just curious
Okay.
about sort of like your muse, or how the process worked.
Well, when I did Threads, the little kids book and Going North, I found that narrative did help. Because I didn't have any photos, and then Marianne at the Ginger Press said, "No, you need to put your pictures into your book." So that was a bit of a twist. But because they were just nice little watercolors, I did have fun with those ones. So anyway, I'm happy to be able to say that Lest We Forget is being revised. It'll have an official ISBN number, and after 20 years of writing this, I'm hoping, I did glean some more information because there were some mistakes in that. It was a very honest first attempt, different names and dates, and I don't think there was much exclusion. Like I think there was a lot of. I think we got everybody, and but now it needs to be embellished. So that book is in the works, and hopefully it'll be out for, I'm going to say, February, Black History Month. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yay!
I guess just if there was anything else you wanted to say before we go, but thanks so much.
You are quite welcome, and thanks for this series. It's lovely. It's like informative, and thanks folks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks again. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining as well.
Great.